Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here with us.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending this evening. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me over. Just very quickly, so I hail from Pennsylvania. I've been there for 32 years. Prior to that, I was from Switzerland and France. So you might hear a little accent. I hope it's not too troublesome. As I joked to my gracious host, yes, I was in the military, but the Swiss military, we haven't fought in a very long time. I think our last war was around 1847. I understand it was a very civil war, literally, but anyway, I digress. We're not here to talk about the Swiss, but about the French and their rather complicated relationship with the United States. We're not going to cover all of it because, of course, then we'd be here till next month. But just the origins of it, how it is that these two nations form a kind of odd couple. And I hope to show you a little bit how this happened over this time frame of roughly 1750 through the late 1790s. And to try and understand what is the legacy of this unlikely alliance. That's why I chose the title, It's Complicated, because just like any odd couple, oh my goodness. We'll be talking, of course, about military history. After all, this is a military history lecture series. But I come at it from the vantage point of social and political history as well. In other words, there's some elements that we need to bring in to understand how it is that these two nations became allies. Simply put, there's first a context. I'm inviting you first to this context. I'm a historian, and when I do history, we have the nasty habit in professional history to do a lot of framing. And that's what we're going to do a little bit here first. So, without further ado, the setting of this 18th century, where these two meet, is a strange era. It's an era of despotism, but also of enlightenment. Despotism, you all are familiar with it, and that the crazy king who rules the American colonies is George III. He shares something with the French king. At the time, it's a whole series of Louis XIV, 15th, 16th, and they are all king by divine right, and of course they have a direct line to God. Okay, and of course, this is the beauty of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, as an intellectual movement in the early 1700s, starts saying, wait, why do these guys get to talk to God? Like, what empowered them to do this? And of course, saying this nowadays, it's part of democracy, it's part of common discussion, it's part of philosophy. But back then, it got you beaten up in the streets, or worse, you got a roast and toast, and it was not a friendly kind of roast and toast, as you can imagine. And so just to summarize what the Enlightenment was about, because this is what inspired, in fact, our founding fathers, there was one philosopher, mathematician named Kant, German, who summarized the Enlightenment by saying it was as if suddenly bright lights had been shown in the darkest corners of Europe. Oops. Actually, on the side, I'm a historian of technology, and I always have problems with technology, go figure. Back to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment questioned everything, and it's something that would be, we could spend, in fact, several hours on it. But the point is that by questioning the notion of authority, it actually began to inspire also many others to challenge this authority. Now, in the United States, you know how this happens, of course. But in France, it's a little bit more complicated because you do have a king by divine right who is in fact in charge of one of the most powerful nations on earth. And this is the complicated thing. If you travel back, not quite 250 years, okay, but let's say about 300 years, or even 275 years, let's split the difference. The most powerful nation on earth at the time happens to be France. Not the UK, not any other nation. France has a growing population, it has an incredible income, it has fought successfully so many wars that basically it doesn't know what to do with its territory. Unfortunately, when you're at this level of what is called hubris, you are about to fall flat on your face. And indeed, this is what will happen, sadly, to the French. But you have to imagine the French as a kind of superpower at the time.
He gave us the Statue of Liberty.
Indeed, they did. And in fact, we'll talk about this at the end. But at the time, they're not thinking of liberty, because the King of France, he's king by divine right, he's not interested in liberty. So, in this age of Enlightenment, you have the founding fathers who are also basking in the influence of John Locke, who you see on the right, and also sometimes interacting with the likes of these two fellows, Voltaire and Rousseau. They're relevant because they all inspire these notions of early, independence. But where, of course, the powder, if you will, lights up, is in the form of a different kind of business, the Anglo-French entanglements. France may be the major power at the time, but of course the British are just as eager to have a piece of the pie, and in fact they're beginning to dominate the seas quite a bit, which of course the French don't like at all. And so what had been a temporary peace around 1748, finally from 1748 onward, there was a little bit of peace between France and the UK, it's reignited over what is called in the United States the French and Indian Wars, or French and Indian War. That's what it's called in the US, by the way. As far as the Europeans are concerned, it's just a 7-year war. That's how they identify it. They don't even think about the early skirmishes. So when you do history, it gets complicated. Are you doing European history, American history? We're in the United States, so let's do American history here. It pits the two greatest nations, and what is unique about this event is that, unlike previous battles that had pitted France and United Kingdom against each other in Europe, this is a battle that begins in a colony, future United States, and of course ends in a colony, but also spreads to the rest of the world. So this is why it's important, and we often tend to forget about it, but it is something that in fact has world consequences. So this colonial entanglement, what does it involve? Of course, English troops versus French troops, who control from Canada, as you can see on the map, and then slowly spread down. And of course, the borders are not quite defined yet. There's all kinds of challenges about who should control Maine, where does Vermont end, or where does it start, and so on and so forth. This complicated element ends up with a whole series of skirmishes that you see listed on this map, including things that start initially with maybe successes for the so-called Redcoats, the British, but then also end up with sometimes victories for the French. It is in this context that we have an unlikely encounter. Mr. George Washington, young George Washington, barely a captain or colonel. Some of you experts will probably correct me on this one, but he's certainly not a general yet, okay? But in 1754, he is an Englishman. He is not an American. That's the important thing to remember. And as he engages the French in battle, there's a whole series of skirmishes, and one of them is the Battle of Fort Necessity, which is in present-day Fayette County, Pennsylvania. And in that battle, interestingly, the French win. What is poor George Washington to do? Well, he's actually quite cunning. He's actually very smart. And while he does indeed lack experience at the time, he is able nonetheless to negotiate an armed withdrawal with the French. In other words, he gets to, he admits that he has lost this battle, but he gets to withdraw with his troops. He's not a pure prisoner of war at all. There's just one small problem in that little story. It's the piece of paper that George Washington is handed over to sign. George Washington is the father of our nation, but he doesn't speak a word of any other language but English. And so when the French hand him ceremoniously this beautiful diplomatically written document, and these are beautifully handwritten, of course, he just puts his signature to it, and in so doing, he admits to having ordered the attack and fired the first shot, thereby killing a French nobleman.
Well, how old was he then?
That doesn't go over very well with the French, but there's like, we have our proof, he has admitted to it, and of course it's one of those simple little diplomatic skirmishes. There was no truth, in fact, to that. It seems to have been more a question of a misunderstanding between the two sides. But as far as the French are concerned, their honor is first preserved. It was the naughty Americans who attacked. And of course, I should remember, I'm sorry, that's my bad. I should say it's the naughty English who have attacked, because this man is an Englishman, okay? It's in that context of mounting enmity between the two sides that we end up with the famous, at least for the Europeans, 1756 to 1763 7-Year War. And it is a long-lasting war resulting in multiple British expeditions, French counter-expeditions. The French are masterful at gaining Indian allies, Native American allies, notably the Abenaki in northern Massachusetts, a few other groups. And in fact, in the initial phases through 1758, the French are victorious. By 1759, they began to slowly lose certain battles. Fort Duquesne, for example, in near Pittsburgh Falls. Other battles eventually result in the failure of the French general, a fellow named Montcalm, to actually gain the advantage. And so the result by 1763 is what you see on the map. There may be a few French speakers left, but there is no longer a French possession in Northern America, with the exception of a tiny set of little islands right below the big one that is Newfoundland, okay? It's St. Peter and Miquelon, two tiny little pieces of land that actually still belong to France today, go figure. Yes, sir?
I also think they also have Caribbean colonies.
They do have Caribbean colonies. In fact, that's what the negotiation is. The Crown is absolutely desperate to keep that because it's the sugarcane. That's the one thing that is definite riches. You're right to point it out. And of course, they still have Louisiana. There's no little short guy with a funny hat who's put it out for sale yet. You know Napoleon, of course. But that's beyond the scope of our meeting. But thanks for pointing this out. And by the way, if anyone wishes to interrupt or correct me, as I am more of a historian of Europe, please don't hesitate to ask questions, okay? Thank you for that. So, this defeat in 1763, what does it amount to? Of course, it's a great victory for the British because now they have essentially ascertained their full control over most of what they wanted in the North American continent. For the French, it is a huge humiliation. It's something that Louis XV, who is ailing, he's very old by then, he doesn't know what to do. In fact, we think that he's beginning to also become senile, sadly. And his young son is too young yet to rule. In fact, it's not his son, it's his great-grandson by then. And so the result is that between 1763 and 1774, which is when a young Louis XVI becomes King of France, the French have to figure out what they want to do. And there's several reactions, interestingly, to this 7-Year War. The first one is rather than just mope in their corner, they choose to reorganize their armed forces. The way one needs to do it, you've failed, you've lost something, what was the reason for it? And so they ask Marquis de Choiseul, whom you see here, to just actively restructure the armed forces. What do we need exactly? We want a professional army. Do we want volunteers? Possibly. Do we want foreigners that we might pay, okay, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe not, because of course what happens with these guys when they're not paid? Yes, sir.
I also have a question. Would you say that the 7 Years War / 9, however you want to refer to it, would you say it counts as the World War I to the Revolutionary War as World War II?
The question is, would I compare World War I or II to the revolution, to these wars?
Yeah, to the French.
Not at all. But I'll explain very quickly why. World War I and II were so-called total wars. where everybody is involved, the population, the economy, the whole nation, even when it's not directly being bombed.
Where was Napoleon at?
Napoleon in 1763 does not exist yet. Give him 6 years and then he'll pop out of his mommy's tummy in Corsica. 1769 is when he's born.
Pretty powerful guy.
So he's got time, yeah, absolutely. But as I said before, I need to set up what is happening here. How it is that a major power that happens to be, run by an absolute king chooses to actually help a bunch of ragtags gain their independence. And so this first reorganization of the French military forces means that you end up with approximately 200,000 soldiers. It's a mix of royal guards, infantry, cavalry. There are foreign mercenaries indeed, but not that many, because you want to be able to have people who are absolutely true to the crown. But of course, this is extremely expensive, as you can imagine. And this is one of the problems that they have when France checks its bills after 1763, at least on the military side. They are beginning to bleed pretty heavily. They're still the major power in Europe, but things are not going so well. So that's the first reaction of the French. 1774, Louis XV is dead. Long live the king. Louis XVI comes up. People are very hopeful in him. He's young, he's 23, inexperienced, okay? But they are so done with his great-grandfather that anything is going to be better as far as they're concerned. They had to bury Louis XV by night, if that gives you an idea, so that people wouldn't pelt his coffin with stuff. Anyway, what do? And the young king is immediately introduced to the problem of England. He was, of course, schooled in some of these international matters, but now he's the one in charge of making decisions. And he understands that it would be a nice way of getting back at the British to have a strong army and indeed initiate a war of revenge. But how are you going to do so? By 1774, there are clear reports that the American colonies are not doing well. Oh, they're doing fine, but they're unhappy with their British ruler. And but there's a problem here. For years, the French have been saying that the Brits are awful, and their colonies, therefore, are awful. So you need to sort of change the mood. You can't just say, oh, these American colonies, those poor people, they're so sweet, let's give them a break. It's not going to work well with public opinion. And I should explain, public opinion in France, 90% of the population doesn't care. They're farmers, they can barely read, but it's those 10% of nobility, clergy, and what we would call the bourgeoisie back then, what we prefer to call the middle class nowadays, the gentry. They're the ones who can read. They're the ones who make deals. They are not pro-American at all. And so you need to start shifting the opinion. In other words, not quite fake news, we're not there, okay? But certainly propaganda, emphasizing certain events, de-emphasizing others, and stressing time and again how unhappy these poor American colonists are in relation to their British ruler. In other words, over the course of approximately 2 to 4 years, and then later on even further, there is, for example, this gazette that is published that is in fact not a real gazette. Okay, there's the Gazette of New York that is very famous, the Gazette of Philadelphia. This gazette, called the Gazette Françoise, French Gazette basically, is in fact something completely orchestrated by the French foreign minister on behalf of the king to make the Brits look bad and the French feel that they have to do something to help. Okay, and the trick seems to work to a degree. In other words, the British made to look bad, that's no surprise. But the fact that the American colonists are now welcome as a possible group to aid, that's very, very interesting because you have a confluence of events that is going to occur. The third reaction is not French, it's British, and you will know about it. We all studied it in school, okay? You're gonna pay for that 7 years war. Okay, and the British themselves realize that their debt has doubled. Therefore, where are we going to find it? Well, when in doubt, always raise taxes, one of those things that we cannot avoid. But of course, they choose to impose these on their colonies. And this is where it does not go well. As you know, we have the famous Boston Tea Party event, but there's also the repeal of the British Stamp Act. late 1775, which is replaced the moment it is abrogated officially in March 1766 with, on the very same day, something called the Declaratory Act. And what did the Declaratory Act do in 1766? It basically said the British Parliament decides to legislate on the colonies whenever and whatever it wants to. Okay. In other words, oh sure, we'll give you back, but now we decide on everything. Never mind your representatives. So you can imagine, of course, that the steam is going to start rising in pressure. We're going to jump ahead, but the point is, I hope you understand, that basically it's this confluence of the French frustrated at losing their war to the British, the American colonists frustrated at this additional taxation, even though they had to fight the French recently, that then changes certain conditions. And as the American elite that was schooled in the Enlightenment starts to realize that George III as its absolute ruler is really not what it seeks, this is when they start trying to find allies. But you can't find an ally if you are not a formal nation. Okay? So what are you going to do? Well, send spies. The Continental Congress, the early Continental Congress, okay? So this is over the course of that decade, 1766 to 1776. I'm jumping a little bit ahead here. This Continental Congress it really needs to find a way to secure some alliances. And initially, what they decide is to maybe send so-called commercial agents, people who could make connections with the French gentry or any gentry throughout Europe. The gentry is, as I said, the future middle class, but in other terms, they are lawyers, doctors, captains of industry, okay, people who might be able to sell some materials to the colonies. And that's what, for example, Silas Deane is charged with. He's supposed to be visiting France on behalf of Congress as a purchaser. That's his official function. In reality, he's a total spy. Okay. And in many ways, the actions of Silas Deane and others they're better than James Bond. Okay. Except they don't have a happy ending like in the British movies. Why? Because Silas Deane, gets this official cover. He's able to buy. He makes a whole series of official and unofficial contacts, especially with the French foreign minister. But then he's also dealing with really unsavory privateers and buccaneers, whoever will carry the stuff for him across the Atlantic. And it's this kind of sort of mishmash where he takes 5% to refinance something and so on and so forth. This is going to give him a bad reputation. The irony is that the person you're looking at here is in fact the first American representative to France, who will be eventually, of course, replaced by Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. But until this happens, he is the one who is truly in charge of everything. And this is going to be, apologize, there we go. And this is something that is going to cost him dearly. He will be accused, in fact, when he returns to the United States by Congress of all kinds of financial misdealings. And he'll never quite recover from that. He won't be in trouble necessarily, but it's certainly one of the sort of darker sides of the American and French revolutions is that you have a lot of people who try to help one way or the other, but of course sometimes their personal interests or politics may have gotten in the way. But Silas Deane is the first one who in fact gets weapons for the American revolutionaries. Another spy, let's talk about one on the French side. Oh, by the way, that's one I forgot. It is Silas Deane who introduces Lafayette with a special letter to the Continental Army. Lafayette is a young French nobleman, very interested in the cause. What is a nobleman doing interested in, ideas of freedom and democracy? A lot of the younger nobility was actually very open to that. This notion that there shouldn't be an absolute king, but maybe a constitutional king like in England. And so Lafayette, in fact, chooses to go to the United States, and it is a letter from Silas Deane that introduces him to the Continental Army and the Continental Congress. More on that later. If you want to think of spies, and let's stay with spies just for a brief time, meet a fellow named Pierre de Beaumarchais. Beautiful name, by the way, but he's a playwright, actually. If any of you enjoy or have listened to opera, classical opera, like Mozart, the Marriage of Figaro, a few others, he wrote the librettis, in other words, the novels or the plays on which these operas are based. So what is a guy like this, who's really decent as a novelist, as a playwright, what is he doing becoming a spy? Well, this is the typical, also, the peculiarities of revolutions and great events, is that they draw all kinds of people. Look at his name, it's Pierre de Beaumarchais. Okay. And the particle suggests a certain nobility. Back then, you were either born into nobility, or if you were broke, or if you were not in the noble realm, but you had money, you married into it, and then you inherited it, in other words, the old-fashioned way. Okay. And that's what he does. He marries, in fact, the enriched widow of a fellow from whom he had already bought a certain title. Funny title, actually, because he was in control of the royal pantry. What it means is that he was simply bringing the king his food. Okay. But because he's close to the king, you like the food, you like some salt, etc., he in fact convinces the king to also send him on secret missions. So he's an opportunist. Okay. But what does Beaumarchais do? Well, he also then deals with his American counterpart, Cyrus Dean, and he arranges to ship weapons to United States, well, future United States. In other words, there is also this work behind the scenes, away from the great pronouncements of the governments, that in fact plays a role in slowly drawing the French to side with the Americans. Right now, we're still around 1775, early 1776. Okay. The French have their sympathies for the United States, but they're still sort of wondering about, should we really help them? And time and again, there's this notion, well, on the other hand, is sticking it to the British. Yes, let's do that. Okay. What kind of material are they sending them? Let's get still a little bit to some of the military stuff. Among these commercial deals, literally, instead of buying crumpets, he's buying cannons. This is the famous 4-pounder, which you can see in many military museums around the United States. Its initial name was Canon de 4 Créboval. It's basically the 4-pounder is fired simply the typical round bullets that we've all seen in museums. Although some were filled with explosives, and the idea was that they would detonate either in the air or upon hitting. Eventually, they are replaced by more regular shells, as we might call them. But it has an amazing history in that the advantage of that 4-pounder is that it was mobile. Earlier cannons that were also shipped by the French and that the Americans were also familiar with were much older. They were known as one was a Swedish design, it was a Valier system, as it's called, for those of you familiar with artillery. And the Valier system simply fired the cannon, but it fired straight. So if you wanted to fire at an angle, you had to basically move the thing, and it was extremely heavy, very, very difficult to lift, very difficult to move about. Here the French came up with a system where the cannon was 2 different lengths, but also relatively easy to move, and because it was on wheels. So when we say it's lighter, let's not think that it's an easy move, but it is manageable. It is much more mobile. And most importantly, you're looking at one of the very early so-called howitzer systems. In other words, a cannon that fires at an angle to actually hit its target, never directly, but using basically the angle of artillery. So it involves certainly some mathematical calculations, which the French share with the Americans as they start to discover this thing. This thing is going to be used through much of the 19th century still, before being replaced. But it makes a big difference. There is an interesting irony, as I noted, French design first used in the American War. Why? Because the French come up with that invention in the 1750s. But they're afraid to introduce it to their own army because the old-fashioned officer corps says, no, we don't want that thing. Oh, this is ridiculous. Like, you want to put it with infantry? What is going on? This is ridiculous, etc. So they first tested it basically in the United States. How convenient. Okay. And of course, once they see the success in the United States, this is when it becomes, goes into full use in the French military. Another of the big supplies that the French furnished the revolutionaries, it's the so-called 1763 model musket. By March 1777, you've got 25,000 of those. They're known in France as the Charleville, but the US, the nomenclature is the 1763. The revolutionaries have very few muskets, have very few weapons that they can fire. And so having this is sort of really very much welcome. I say 25,000, but basically in all, the French will deliver over 115,000 or so of such weapons. Now, some of them are the 1763 model. This is one that's kept in the National Army Museum. Smithsonian also has one or two of these. But, you know, well, the French sold them to the Americans, okay. There's also a little sneaky side to the French. What else is new? Simply put, the 1763 model is an improvement over the 1732, 1725 models. Okay, it's lighter, but it's sturdier, but it's also heavier, in fact. Not lighter, sorry, heavier. And so what do the French do within 3 years? On the 1766 model, they make it lighter, and then they sell to the rebellion, the old 1763 model. Of course, the Americans quickly realized, wait, you got a 1766, it's much lighter, we want that one too. And so eventually the French delivered the 1766 model. But initially, they're basically passing on the stuff they had already thought, well, it's not bad, but it's heavy. It's not unique, by the way, to the French to do so. The US Air Force thankfully delivered a lot of F-84s and F-86s to the Europeans right after World War II, when they barely had an Air Force, and they were becoming obsolete in the United States, but very useful to the Europeans. So it's something that's universal, is what I'm arguing here. Okay. Anyway, these weapons, they're basically a way of sending a message, we are with you, but we are not going to fully commit to you yet. This is all done hush-hush, with spies, merchants, and so on and so forth. What changes next? Well, 1776, of course, the Declaration of Independence, whereupon the British now engage in open warfare. You all are familiar with the American Revolution, so it's inappropriate of me to get back into the story, but, oh yes, sir.
Let me get a picture of me.
I asked your wife, there we go. Martha couldn't find the portrait, so I had that. The 1777 victory at Saratoga, which was not the first American victory, it was the first notable one. This is when the French realized, oh, wait a minute, these guys are pretty good about what they're doing. Let me explain the background. By 1776, when the Declaration of Independence is made, there's been a shift in Paris. The representative is no longer the gentleman spy that I talked about, but it is now negotiated in part by Benjamin Franklin. And Thomas Jefferson is not quite on board yet, okay? He'll come later. But Ben Franklin is in Paris, and when he's not busy partying, for he is a party animal, he actually woos all kinds of noblemen, he encourages them to pay attention to the Americans. It's a very, very slow process back and forth, because you have to talk to the intendant, the superintendent, the minister, who might approach the king. We'll see about this, we'll get back to you. Diplomacy is the art of patience. Ben Franklin is good at it, but of course it's not resolving the situation in the field. That battle, that victory, changes everything around. By the time the news reaches Paris, the French realize, wow, this time these guys are serious. We might be able to actually help them officially and not just pour money into something that is a lost battle, a lost victory. The victory at Saratoga convinces the French that it's worth it. And that same year, Lafayette, who is already volunteering, as I mentioned, with the American forces, he's injured at this Battle of Brandywine. And the news of his injury and then his reports to the French authorities also make clear that, basically he says the Americans are fighting with valiance, they know their stuff, they're not professional, but they have sort of a lot of grit, a lot of will. This is not just a storm in a teacup. I simplify, of course, the very beautiful letters that Lafayette writes. He is a nobleman with long, long, long letters home. But that also is going to make a difference. Still, if you are the King of France, you have yourself a problem. It's not, young, bashful heroes like Lafayette or amazing victories like Saratoga that are going to sway you. Louis XVI has always been described as basically a nice guy present at the wrong time. Okay, and we'll see why later. And so he's trying to sort of follow what his advisors are telling him. And he's got good advisors, by the way. Okay, he's not completely out to lunch by far, far less than his great-grandfather was. Who in France isn't quite feeling it yet? There's two people who are important. First one on the right, he is Minister Vergennes. Vergennes is a very, very wise man. He's very experienced. He is much more royalist than democratic, but he's also very much aware of the financial problems of France. And he takes a look at the situation and says, this thing is going to sink us so bad, we cannot do so. But there's one sentiment, this is his brain telling him, this is going to cost us too much, we'll die. His heart says, anything to kill the Brits. He absolutely despises, he's still so angry at the French defeat that he wants a revenge. And so he basically insists that, yes, we should help the Americans, that's what he tells his king, but let's slow down, let's wait and see to be sure that we know what is happening, okay? And so he's recorded for the first time in 1775, and it's a document called Réflexion, which is a very cute word to say, not reflections, but like lots of musings and thinking and this and that, in which he eventually agrees that maybe we should help, and then he adds a second document in March 1776, he calls it Considération, considerations, which is another long musing, but at which he basically says, we may need to in fact proceed. The other thing that's slowing down Vergennes on the right is the fellow on the left. His name is Turgot, and I need to set it up a little bit because it's going to become relevant later on. When in 1774 young King Louis XVI shows up, there is no budget in France. It doesn't exist. They collect taxes, they spend them on wars, a lot of stuff at Versailles. The system set up, by the way, by King Louis XIV was to invite all the noblemen to Versailles to weaken their power in their own lands. And this is where they hung out. Of course, that doesn't produce anything. So you can imagine the country slowly sinking into debt. And the wars, of course, have made this worse. Turgot is a very good intendant, finance minister. And he realizes, if you do this without carrying out the reforms that you should be carrying out, then we will not be able to survive. And Turgot fights. He fights, for example, to finally have a proper tax system instituted, because most of the clergy and the nobility did not pay taxes. You can see where this is going, obviously. And so the consequence is that Turgot is very honest, unfortunately too honest. Because when the moment he starts saying, let's tax the nobility reasonably, he's not calling for big taxes, but a kind of graduated tax, what we would call that today. Basically, the nobles immediately appeal to Louis XVI's weak link, Marie Antoinette, his wife. And Queen Marie at Versailles has Turgot fired. And this will be the same sequence later on with another minister named Necker and another one named Calonne. They're less relevant to our story. But all the finance ministers of France under Louis XVI until the Revolution all say, we are making a financial mistake. In other words, they're not opposed to the idea of helping, but they say, where is the benefit? How are we going to gain from this? So you've got two formidable opponents, although Vergennes basically will be swayed by his hatred of the British, and this is why eventually they will agree. So that's for the French side. So far, so good? Okay. Well, we still have a little bit of time before our break, so how about the Americans? Congratulations, you just become United States. Oh, that's great. How's your constitution? Oh, we're still working on that in 1787. We'll get back to you, okay? But the point I'm making is it's not a critique of the young America. It's just that there's so much that you have to reinvent, rebuild. What do you take? What do you reject? And of course, it's part of the fascinating part of American history. But one thing is, how do you get allies? How do you establish foreign relations? Convince other countries to accept you as a valid nation state. The term nation state, by the way, back then doesn't exist yet. It's something that's invented later in international relations. But the point is, you want people to talk to you, okay? And so it's funny because you've got two fellows who actually agree on this. One is George Wythe, and the other one is John Adams. We don't need to reintroduce John Adams. George Wythe is interesting because he's perhaps one of the most amazing good guys of the American Revolution. He's always in the background. I'll give you a quick background on him. He was a delegate to Virginia's 1776 Constitutional Convention. He helped design the Seal of Virginia. So if you go to Virginia, you're always going to have some kind of Wythe Square, Wythe Avenue somewhere, of course. But the interesting thing is that he was a judge most of his life, but he was also a mentor to a bunch of guys named Thomas Jefferson, John Marshall, first Supreme Court judge, etc., etc. Several of Henry Clay as well, by the way, and other men. And they all became American leaders, but they also always sort of came back to him. In fact, when Wythe dies, he gives away most of his library to Thomas Jefferson. Anyway, why is he important? Well, he suggested that there should be some kind of model treaty drawn up that would include always the same questions to center nations and see if they would speak to the United States. And the model treaty is pretty intricate, as you can imagine, but basically it includes these three questions, these three requests. Free ports to guarantee our free goods, okay, and back and forth, mutual. Freedom of neutrals to trade in normal goods. In other words, let's not make them part of the problem in the context of warfare. And of course, agree on what is contraband. Okay, is it tobacco? Is it something else? These are the matters. And George Wythe basically writes to John Adams, who accepts it. He's very enthusiastic, and he says, okay, this is a perfect advantage, and in fact, one nation we can hit with that is France. John Adams has kept up with, the international situation. In fact, the one thing that we have to credit John Adams with, he used to read the ancient Greek authors that had been rediscovered in the early 1700s, notably a guy named Thucydides, who wrote the Peloponnesian Wars, which is a combination of military and diplomatic history. It's still required reading, by the way, in many military academies. Okay, and in fact, he wrote to his son later on, read Thucydides, don't read anything else, read that guy, and you'll be good to go. Probably an exaggeration, but anyway, he is very much aware of the international situation. The enemy of your enemy is your friend. It's a cliche, but it can work to a degree, and that's why he's eager to try this on the French. John Wythe will disappear from this equation. He was a family man. He basically resigned just after the Declaration of Independence to go and take care of his dying wife. Interestingly, right after the Declaration of Independence, he was one of the few guys to say slavery is wrong, and he freed his slaves entirely. It's not a guy we remember much, sadly, but he was a very interesting example. Anyway, let's move on. What do they do? Well, John Adams passes this treaty model onto Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin goes back and forth. Remember, we left him in Paris trying to get somebody to talk to him. It's about time. 1778, finally, we have an alliance. It's a combination. There's a treaty of amity and commerce based on that model treaty that you just saw, okay, that Wythe had initially designed. And then there's also a treaty of alliance between Louis XVI and the Second Continental Congress. It's a defensive one, versus you can't just attack unilaterally. How are you going to do that? Well, that's old in international relations. For those of you familiar with World War I and World War II, in fact, that's how it was invoked. We were attacked first, and other conflicts as well. And so basically the French government in March 1778, so just weeks after this treaty is signed, they send a messenger to London. It's not that far. That's, at the time, it was about a day to day and a half by horse and boat. Okay, and they tell the crown, "Oh, we're sorry, we're going to recognize these independent United States." And in fact, we've concluded a couple of treaties with them. So this is March 13th. March 17th, Great Britain declares war on France. And so there you are. You wanted your defensive alliance to kick in. It's kicking in because you did not declare war on the UK. They declared it on you. Now France can jump in. Okay. So if we take stock here so far, what do we have? We have ourselves two countries that are very unlike each other, or two cultures unlike each other. Okay, one that is eager for essentially the establishment of a republic along the lines of the principles of the Enlightenment, the rediscovery of democratic principles from ancient Greece, some of the laws of ancient Rome, in fact, as well. And then another country that is happily in the middle of an absolute king, although a lot of its elite is undercover thinking of the Enlightenment as well. Okay, but that's it. Louis XVI has taken the dive, and he is going to start supplying forces to help. Shall we break here, or shall we carry on for a few minutes?
That's where would you like to break?
I think that's where I shall break. To be continued, as like they say on the movies, in the TV, on the TV. But we'll pick up then to see how this goes in a moment. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. So we left off with the good news of the alliance. Now, of course, who should go? When are they going? When is the help arriving? Because after the joy of the Declaration of Independence and eventually the Great Saratoga and of course this alliance with France, these are good, boosts for American morale, but it doesn't necessarily resolve the situation yet. And the French are going to try and move fairly fast, but first they have to make a decision. They have to decide who they're going to send, because that's what the Congressional Army is hoping for, to have some professionals who can also train them, teach them some of the tricks. Of course, they have some very good people there, but they're inexperienced, they have a lot of militiamen. You have to remember that the Continental Army, as we call it then, is more a bunch of ragtag volunteers. They sign up for 20 days, they have to get back to the farm. Some of them are professionals, others are trying to get away from family issues or other matters, financial problems. It's not the army that we can conceive of nowadays. Okay, and so France is, of course, deciding who to send. They are not going to send the best. They're keeping the best to manage what's left of their colonies. They're very concerned about that. But they are going to look for the most experienced. In other words, they don't want to have people who are completely new to the show. So they select them very carefully. What is interesting is also they don't want to send too many soldiers at once, because they are aware that, and this is an interesting report from Lafayette, who says if you send too many French soldiers at once, you're going to think of them as the invaders, just like the British. And so send forces, good forces, so for a show of force, but don't send too many. And so the initial operation takes place in April 1778, so it's pretty fast. So within 2 months of the signing of the treaty, you have a fleet of 12 ships led by this admiral named Destin, reportedly a great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of Giscard d'Estaing, who was president of France in the 1970s. So maybe, we're not sure, he claimed that, but who knows. Anyway, Count d'Estaing sails off with 12 ships, approximately 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers. Some sources say 6,000. It tends to be realized. The idea is that initially you want to blockade the British fleet in the Delaware River. That would be nice. But British leaders have intelligence that the French are coming. And of course, you can't exactly hide a fleet of 12 ships, especially on the North Sea between France, on the Channel, as they call it. So of course, the Brits were able to send a message, and basically the British are ready. Still, what's interesting is the British response is very slow. And part of D'Estaing's fleet is actually from the Mediterranean. So they could very easily block the French at a place called Gibraltar, which is still a British possession today. Okay. By the time London decides what to do, the French have happily sailed through Gibraltar and they're on their way. The only thing that is a saving grace for the British is that the winds are not favorable at the time to Admiral D'Estaing, and it takes him close to 3 months to rally continental America. Sometimes it's the bad luck of the draw, the season. In this case, it takes them this long. So you can imagine, of course, the troops are exhausted, the sailors are exhausted, the water supplies are low, and so the first attempt at collaboration is not going to go super well. I call it you could call it meh. Question, sir.
With good winds, how long did it take to cross?
Very good winds. You could make the crossing, at least from England to North America, in 3 to 4 weeks. That was the standard estimated, but it could. There was never a guaranteed arrival. There was always an idea that it could be 6 weeks, and that was often what happened. In the winter, though, it tended to be longer, and that's of course because of the storms. Other question? Yes, sir.
Are we going to be talking about what's going on in
Absolutely, absolutely. So this is actually a representation of the arrival of Admiral D'Estaing in the Bay of Rhode Island. Now, how does he end up in Rhode Island? Is he supposed to be at the Delaware River? Forgot to ask for directions, maybe, who knows? But no, the point is, the French fleet initially makes it to near New York in August of 1778. I mean, it took them this long, So first they made it towards the Delaware River, they changed course, they go towards New York. What they realize is that New York has a whole series of bars, okay? Now, I'm not talking about the happy stuff, but the ones where you can't sail over because it's the sandbars. And New York has always been notorious for this to this day, okay? And there's certain channels that you can't get through. Now, at certain tides you could get through, but could you get 12 ships through there? That was the complicated matter. And so D'Estaing changes his mind. On August 8th, he tries to make his way to Newport Harbor, and this is where he disembarks with about 4,000 troops. So instead of showing up where he was supposed to be, he's in Rhode Island. But still, he's very much welcome. There are connections being made. But in the meantime, he and his ships have also, they've had some skirmishes with the British fleet. You can see it partially illustrated here. But also they've had to weather several storms. And their boats are, their ships, I should say, are damaged. Okay. What is D'Estaing to do? Rhode Island Harbor is a tiny, tiny little harbor. It's not. It's more for fishing. It's not really for anything else. And so he decides to actually rally Boston to effect repairs there. Before that, though, he informs the local, continental troops, their leaders, that he has to leave. Of course, the news is not very well received. What, you're leaving us? The Brits are here? What are we supposed to do? Okay, and so basically, D'Estaing says, look, and in fact, there's a general, British general, I'm trying to remember his name. Sorry, let me get my notes. Oh yeah, General Sullivan, who continues to press, says, we could take out the British in 48 hours with your 4,000 men, etc. And this guy actually has experience from the 7-Year War and the War of Succession in Austria. Not in 2 days, not in 2 weeks, we can't do that. We need to be better prepared. We don't have a strategy, we don't know the terrain, you might know it, we don't. And this is where you see a difference of opinion between the French experienced guy who doesn't know the territory and the guy who may not have the training of that French admiral, who was previously a general, but at the same time maybe has a different feel for the situation. He's unable to change his mind. Sullivan writes several letters up to Boston to complain about the admiral. In fact, when the admiral arrives in Boston, he meets up with Lafayette, who is there, and they get essentially taken to the cowshed by the Americans. Americans. How could you do this to us? This is ridiculous. Apparently some of the original letter that the general had written, Sullivan had written, is so offensive. Basically, you have no honor, and then a couple of what would have been choice words back then. Basically, after having initially written the draft, basically Sullivan realizes, oh, actually they're supposed to be our allies, so he deletes some of that and rewrites parts of it. But the damage is done. The French have shown up, and then they took off. Okay, and so politicians will try to smooth the incident. Okay, Destin is not opposed to helping the Americans. He says, but give me a proper instructions. In fact, he tells Lafayette, look, if you want, downgrade me to colonel in your infantry, and I'll serve. But based on my experience, we could not do that. So was Destin at fault? Military historians will go back and forth on this one, but the result is still the same. It was what we would call an unwelcome decision to retreat, okay, leaving Lafayette and Sullivan to try and defend this area. Eventually they have to clear the area. The British themselves will stay until 1779, but then they will in fact abandon Rhode Island. But in such a shape that it's basically a basket case. They've been essentially helping themselves to all the supplies, taking over houses, burning some down. In other words, basically the defense of Rhode Island has failed, but also its survival is at stake. Okay. So that's for take one. Not exactly a good record for a new ally. Do the Americans have any other allies? They got a nice letter back from the King of Morocco. Okay, so he's happy to help them, but of course he doesn't have a fleet. So this is where things are. They have a little more success recruiting some German troops, Hessians in particular, a few others. The weird part is these German troops, they're basically mercenaries. They're desperate for food to send back home. So this is when you read the Revolutionary Wars about the heroes of their battles. You've got Hessians on one side, you've got Prussians on the other, and then Württembergers are coming back from the other side. It's very, very confusing. But basically, as far as the US is concerned, where are our supplies? Where's our help? And so it's off to America. Take two. Okay. This is the Count of Rochambeau. Okay. And on July 11th, 1780, Rochambeau arrives in Rhode Island. He now has a special mission from King Louis XVI. Their code name is Expédition Particulière. I have to pause on the word because it's kind of funny. So expedition is pretty straightforward. But particulière, in French, something is particular and it can mean anything. In English, at least, we have two words, particular and peculiar. And peculiar, depending on the tone of voice, it means, oh my gosh, this is really weird, and etc., etc. And I think this is why we chose to call it expedition particulière. It's like, we're not saying what it is, maybe it's an aid, maybe it's an actual attack, we'll see, play it by ear, essentially. It's all on you, Mr. Rochambeau, General Rochambeau, to actually figure it out. What does he have on his side? Well, first of all, he's meeting an incredibly cold reception. The Rhode Islanders who have survived, it's like, oh, it's you again. What now? Would you like to go to Boston or go to Virginia? I exaggerated the reaction, but certainly not a warm welcome the way this had experienced it earlier. And so Rochambeau is showing up. He's got 6,000 French soldiers following him. And they've gone really sort of all out. And owing to this bitter taste that was left from the previous venture 2 years earlier, Rochambeau basically sets out to earn the trust of the town's residents. And this is what's interesting. Rather than, have his army bivouac and take over supplies from everywhere the way armies typically did, what Rochambeau has done is not only has he brought 6,000 soldiers, he's brought money. And it's not paper money. Oh yes, we're talking real gold. You wonder why the French went broke? This is the overall numbers that they will have spent to help the revolutionaries of the war. Okay, this is not just what Rochambeau had. But 1.3 billion livres. One livre was, otherwise it was in, 1 louis was worth 24 livres. Okay, The weight differs. I can't give you a CPI because it varied considerably at the time, would be very hard to calculate. But when they're paying in gold or silver and they are buying their supplies from the locals are very happy. It's like, wow, okay, these guys aren't like taking over, okay, like the Brits are, they're not requisitioning. They're actually paying for what we're selling them. Ooh. And you can imagine that the American currency is down the doldrums because of the war. So all of a sudden you've got this huge injection of money coming from the French, not just manpower or weapons, but the good stuff. Yes, sir.
I'd also like to mention, I know you probably picked the second image because it's kind of hard to find royal.
Yeah, but it's from year 2, which will be 1791, after the king is not guillotined, but deposed.
But I mean, I was kind of thinking, oh well, that's not a royal. It's probably not one they'd probably see.
Well, in 1791, there may have been some circulating in continental America as people went back and forth. Although, as we'll see, basically it's drying up pretty fast on the French side.
But I mean, yeah.
But I could not indeed locate one that had the year 1776. I'm sorry about that. They do exist, I'm told. Other questions?
How did they coordinate the two armies?
How did they coordinate the two armies?
Go where they wanted, or Washington asked them to go here, there, and yonder?
You are spot on. You've read my mind. No, you're absolutely right to raise it, because indeed, like it's very nice to show up, but then who's in charge, who do you speak to, who gets your orders. It's one thing, and you don't want to have another one of those showdowns with General Sullivan or any other general for that matter. You need to have very clear understanding of things. This is a very interesting and unlikely friendship, and yet it develops into a friendship. The one on the right, as you know, does not speak a word of other languages, and this guy only speaks French. Looking good. Fortunately, there are enough noblemen and gentlemen who speak other languages, and so in fact they proceed by translation. Of course, you have to hope that the translation is accurate enough. It's not always going to work out, but still, the first meeting is in September 1780 in Hartford, Connecticut. In many ways, it's the first time that General Washington, by now, has seen a Frenchman since his little 1754 encounter. Okay. Of course, he's been over since, but this is the first time that he's meeting the new leader to assist the Continental Army. And unfortunately, things are not good because the French are late. Food and supplies are short. They don't have time to plan anything, so they agree to push back 6 months and meet again. In fact, not 6 months, they meet 10 months later, May 1781. So it's been a while, but of course, let's remember, this is the internet or phone era, so by the time you figure out what's going on, it is going to take a few weeks or a few months. Anyway, they finally decide to join forces to answer your query in May of 1781, and the idea is probably to amass forces around New York City, which would be a logical target. Okay. In fact, Washington, Rochambeau agrees with him, this is going to be a diversion. Okay. They in fact leave a few hundred soldiers to set up as if they were about to have an encampment in preparation for battle. At the time, of course, battles are very formal, there's no guerrilla warfare, and so you know what the enemy is setting up. So they leave these guys in the back, start building the oven for the bread, their encampment, etc. But then the rest of the army slowly make their way to first to Mount Vernon, Washington's place, okay, where the officers hang out. It's like, yeah, this is still gentleman warfare. And so these guys hang out, they get to visit the sites, they get to marvel at Washington's, personal possessions. And then the trade matrix, of course, keep marching on. And this is when, essentially, the French and the Americans get to know each other without necessarily speaking their language. It's worth mentioning this because what do some of those French generals do? They try to get a sense of les Américains. Now, les Américains is a common expression in France nowadays. Back then, they simply probably called them the colonists. Either way, one thing that fascinated the French officers was the diversity of the Continental Army. And one French officer, a French general, actually drew several soldiers, and this actually tells us a lot about historians. We like to have the documents that are written, but art is also very helpful. Because right there we get a sense of the diversity of uniforms. Oh, isn't that quaint? Isn't that sweet? No, it means that they don't have enough uniforms of a single kind. They are poor, they are desperate to have, in fact, standardization. They have, in fact, a whole series of different regiments. One regiment is nicknamed the Black Regiment because most of its soldiers are African American. They are freed slaves, but they are people who have signed on because of the promise of additional freedoms. They did exist at the time. There's also another figure, this guy with a musketeer or light infantryman. He seems to be, in fact, we think, I forget what historians have said, it's a Canadian regiment actually, that's sympathetic to the Continental Army. It goes on and on. You have the riflemen wearing clothing that is associated with the typical Continental Army, and then you have, a guy who may be a Hessian, or we're not exactly sure. Anyway, for those of you familiar with uniforms of that era, this is what French officers see, not in one army, but one regiment alone. In other words, it's a complete mix. And what's interesting is that all, perhaps not always clearly trained they have so much goodwill that they are very impressed. Okay, and these are the reports that the French make back to Paris. That is that these guys are ready. And so it's in this context that we have the famous collaboration of Washington and Rochambeau, the slowly making their way from Boston and Newport, past New York, and then slowly making their way. And this is, by the way, from the National Park Service, apparently a trail that you can follow nowadays. So if you're in the mood for walking and all that, for your summer vacation, perhaps why not? But of course, at Yorktown, you need to still make sure that there is maybe some kind of diversion to challenge the British so that they don't expect you coming. And you've all heard of the Battle of Yorktown. What helps the Battle of Yorktown is a parallel battle, known as the Battle of the Chesapeake, sometimes Battle of the Capes, depending on which books you read. And it's basically interesting because it's a crucial battle. It's in September 1781, early September. You've got a British fleet, a French fleet, okay? And it's strategically decisive because the Navy was supposed to reinforce the troops at Yorktown. And of course, they're being kept busy that way. And because they're kept busy that way, the French are able to achieve control of the sea lanes, which means the Brits can no longer supply their troops. And it is in this context that you have this momentous victory, which I'm not going to go into the detail about because it's very famous. But basically, the French and Americans coordinate their assault and successfully force Lord Cornwallis. Actually, he's in charge of the army, but he's not present at the rendition. It is two of his representatives. I think it was a fellow named Benjamin Lincoln, no relationship, and a fellow named Charles O'Hara. This painting was actually commissioned in 1817. Now it's in the Capitol. John Trumbull was a famous artist, American artist, who drew many of these revolutionary battle scenes very well studied. Because, of course, this doesn't give credit to it. The thing is like 9 feet wide or something along those lines. It's pretty impressive. Yes, sir.
Were there Spanish ships that were active at that part of that blockade?
The answer to the question was, were Spanish ships part of that blockade? Yes. But I do not remember how many and in what positions. In 1779, so just after France goes to war with the British, they convinced Spain to join France on their side. That's because royals in Europe are always related, one way or the other. And in fact, there was a previous relationship with the Spaniards. Of course, Spain joined in exchange for some concessions, some territories and other things. But they did engage the British fleet. Notably, if not directly, certainly to keep it busy. Because also you've got a frigate appearing, it's like, well, how many are there? We'll send 2 ships to stop that. That's 2 ships fewer to battle. It's basic naval tactics, but not being a navier, a sailor myself, sorry, Switzerland, not too much. much more sea. I'm unable to explain that in detail. But yes, you're right, sir, there were some Spaniards involved. This victory at Yorktown, of course, is momentous for young United States. It also sends a very strong message. When the news of the defeat reaches London, by then already British public opinion has said, just let it go. We don't want this anymore. We don't need to be involved in it. And of course, it's the gentry through the House of Commons who controls this, but also the House of Lords is also opposed to further conflict. And so it's in this context that over the course of 2 years, a peace treaty is negotiated with French approval. It takes this long because there's a question of concession of territory. The British, for example, usually don't want to let go of all of that. And then they have to, of course, discuss it amongst themselves. There's the question of fishing rights that already are present at the time. They're a big deal nowadays, but they already existed back then. There's also certain representatives are replaced. And eventually, the American delegation is ready to sign the treaty in September 1783. The British, however, take a while, and they don't sign until November 30th. Eventually, of course, you already have sort of basically the ancestry of the process for laws to pass in the United States. They have to bring it back to the Continental Congress. Actually, it's no longer Continental Congress, I apologize, Congress of the Confederation, as it's called at the time. And this is in Annapolis, January 14th, 1784, that is signed, and then further ratification by Parliament on April 9. Remember, we don't have a constitution yet. That's still 4 years away. So, but the fact that they have this bicameral system that has to approve something that was reached elsewhere, that actually prefigures what our Senate has to do. Any international treaty has to be ratified by our United States Senate, otherwise it's not law. The same thing happens here. Okay. Britain signed separate treaties. They end the conflict with France, Spain, the Dutch republics, also for good measure, which they had attacked even though they were initially neutral. In other words, everyone needs a break. Okay, and come 1783-84, everyone breathes a sigh of relief. Thanks to French money, French troops, there has indeed been a breakthrough. They're our friends, right? It's complicated. I told you it was complicated. You have, of course, what I would call the diehards. On the French side, Count Lafayette, who's returned to France, but is absolutely pro the colonies, in favor of the colonies. A lot of people, members of the French Enlightenment, are very much in favor of what the colonists are doing, creating a republic, because they think of it as a model for them. So they're extremely happy with this, but at the same time, you've got a fellow showing up in Paris. His name is Thomas Jefferson. That's why I have this picture of Monticello. Okay. Why do I have this picture of Monticello? Because basically you're looking at what he liked in France. And he brought it all back. When he came back in 1789, he had something like 60 or 70 crates of French art, French this, French that, 700 bottles of wine. Okay. So very much the ultimate Francophile. And the ultimate Francophile was in fact sent as a minister to Paris. They didn't call him ambassadors back then, he was a minister. But also in the hopes of not just firming up relations with the French, but also in the hopes of establishing formal treaties. He gets one with Prussia, which at this time was the biggest German state. There was no united Germany yet. He does get the one with Morocco, the initial opening, so 1786, the Moroccans do sign something. Why is he not more successful? Well, first, they're still busy working on their constitution, but as we all know from our constitution, our federal government, all powerful that it may be, is in fact structurally weak. It's up to the states. And when you're trying to deal with nations around Europe in particular, where you often have a single head of state, even an absolutist one, okay, then they say, okay, whom am I talking to? Well, you're talking to me, and then I'll bring you down to Congress, and the president might agree, and then go away. We don't want this. We want to know exactly who we're dealing with. Heads of state at a time play a game of chess, divide up their territories, literally looking at maps. that's not something that they understand that the Americans want to do. They think, well, you guys are so messy, we'll talk later, come back to us. And so this is why poor Thomas Jefferson spends a lot of great time in Paris. For those of you who've seen the play Hamilton, he likes to say, no, what did I miss in this song? He's unable to really affect anything. There's also a big problem in France. This is basically the time leading up to the revolution. There is a lot of corruption among the merchant groups, notably some guilds that are in fact asking for extra payments and not delivering at all what they're supposed to deliver. So there's certainly a smell of something rotting somewhere. And so when Thomas Jefferson chats with Marquis de Lafayette and watches what is beginning to happen in 1789, he is actually delighted. He says, oh, okay, now they're beginning to make a change. What change is that? Another revolution. Okay. Now, promise I won't put you through all 10 years, because we'll be here not next month, but next year. But the point of the matter is that the revolution in France starts in an extremely mild manner, much milder than that of the United States. It's about people having too many taxes to pay, rough winters where people started going hungry, and they all write initially letters to the king that are supposed to be delivered to his representatives. And when you read these letters, many have survived in archives, it's amazing. It's like, your beloved majesty, I just want a little bit of bread for my children, that sort of stuff. It's extremely pleading, and it's believing in the king as the father of the nation. This is 1789 in May. By July, they're tearing down the Bastille, the famous Bastille Day. That's the first Bastille Day, on July 14th, 1789. And by 1790, they are forcing the king back to Paris, away from Versailles, saying, you take care of business here. By 1791, he is no longer absolute king, and by 1792, he is in jail, awaiting his sentencing. It goes extremely fast, okay? Jefferson doesn't see that part, but there is one American revolutionary who does. His name is Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, it's another one of these guys where you say, wow, such goodness, but so strange at the same time. A little bit the Virginian I told you about earlier. Thomas Paine actually is an Englishman very much, and it's slowly he gains sort of sympathy for the American revolutionaries. Eventually goes to the United States, but after he does return, he does go to France, and in fact, he is one of several Americans who receives honorary citizenship from the Revolution. George Washington gets it, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, no surprises here. What has Thomas Paine done? Well, he writes, for example, 2 books, short pamphlets in fact, not books, called The Rights of Man, parts 1 and 2. When the British find out about this, first they try to have it burned, and they don't try to have him burned, but they certainly try to put him under arrest. In fact, a lot of what he writes is very inspiring to the French intellectuals who are trying to write French constitutions. Because that's one of the other factors that started the French Revolution. It's not that it simply broke as a direct result of helping the Revolutionary Wars, it's that the successive finance ministers I told you about are completely unable to affect any change. And so France is literally broke. And it's under these conditions that you start having this revolution that snowballs into all kinds of horrible things. Paine, basically, what does his work say? This is important because this is an American whom the French are reading, as opposed to, the French saying, oh, we're too self-important with Voltaire and Rousseau to have anybody pay attention to other stuff. But what does Paine say? He basically advocates the right of the people to overthrow their government. And you say, well, it's been done. We've seen that. Yeah, but this is the first time a guy actually does that and explains the rationale for an overthrow, when basically the needs of the needs of the people are not met. So you've got a writ of arrest issued for him. He flees to France. He doesn't speak a word of French, by the way, just for good measure. And how do the French revolutionaries respond? They make him a member of parliament. He's got a translator to help him, literally. Okay. In 1792, he is in fact trying to help draft the new constitution with something called the French National Convention. It will be like a constitutional congress for us. And so he's helping them. There's two groups at the time in the French convention, what we would call a congress. One is called the Girondins, who are active revolutionaries but still moderate. Okay, they don't want a king, but they don't want a beheaded king either. And at the same time, you have another group called the Montagnards, who are in fact beginning the upper hand. The people of the mountain, literally, because they used to sit at the top of the hemicycle. You know, those parliaments were at the top line, used to throw spitballs, harangue people, etc. And so these Montagnards basically win the race, win the fight, and they regard poor Mr. Paine as an enemy. Why do they regard him as an enemy when he has in fact written material that the French are using themselves in their political pamphlets? Because of the trial of Louis XVI. What leads to the trial, it takes long, but basically he is put on trial for treason. The reality is Louis XVI was not a traitor, that he's a bit of a slob, that he's a nice guy, wrong place, wrong time, fair enough. His wife was a traitor. The letters have been found. She used to send secret missives to her brother, the Emperor of Austria, so he could invade France and rescue her. The letters were found approximately 40 years ago, so we know it's true. But they're going after Louis XVI, and they're saying basically, you know, you are not, you know, the King of France, you are a traitor. Who defends him? You've got quite a few people actually who say we should not execute the king. It's not worth it. Just destitute him, remove him, but don't punish him further. And so he argues, for example, Thomas Paine, that the execution of Louis XVI is unnecessary. He should be exiled to the United States, first as a way of, you know, acknowledging royalist France, who helped the United States. So welcome him to the United States, after all. That's what he says. And then basically he says, I have a moral objection to capital punishment. To which one of the great French revolutionaries, Guillaume, says, well, of course you're against capital punishment, because you're a Quaker. It's anecdotal, but it shows you essentially the lack of cultural understanding that is further, you know, well, let's say directly, poisoning the relationship between France and the United States. Now, of course, France, in fact, at the time, is, of course, getting into a radical phase of its revolution. Louis XVI loses his battle by one vote. One single vote shifts the balance for his condemnation to death. And it is cast by someone who will be King of France later on, whose son will be King of France later on in the 19th century. The ironies of French politics, but we're not here to discuss French politics, I promise. Just the fact of the matter is, once you have the execution of the king, this constitutes what we call a regicide. No. Assassinations tragically happen throughout history. Okay, so the first or the last is going to affect the king. But this sends shockwaves throughout Europe and also beyond the United States. Why? Because a sovereign has been decapitated. What does it mean for other sovereigns, other kings? And the United States is thinking, wow, these guys are really going beyond what we did. We just didn't want to get rid of the king. We didn't want him dead. What are they doing here? And so there's a lot of mistrust as a result. The initial support that the Americans expressed for the French Revolution, because of the help of the French, wanes. It begins to disappear. And not only do they execute Louis XVI, but this is present-day Place de la Concorde. Okay. They of course, for good measure, execute Marie Antoinette. They starve the new king, Louis XVII, who was a very young teenager, to death. These sort of horrible measures, which means that President Washington has a problem. Like, what do I do? These guys helped me, but they are completely mad right now. And so he has to navigate pressure to support France from the 1778 treaty, because France, by murdering its king, is now at war with a lot of crowned heads of Europe. Or does he side with Britain, because after all, the British are finally at peace with him. He needs a break. Okay. This is what prompts George Washington to declare full neutrality. Now, full neutrality sounds logical. if you are George Washington. But when a country declares neutrality and another country is at war and expects the help from that country, basically they view this as an attack. You are either for us or against us, you can't be neither. If you are neutral, then you are helping the Brits. It's a common argument that has been made even in recent wars. Okay. And we see this issue of neutrality turned upside down with the so-called Citizen Genet affair. By then, the relationship, the Treaty of 1778, is considered sort of void because of the French Revolution, because the French are no longer sending money anyway. But they still have diplomatic relations. And the guy they send, a minister, not a religious minister, a diplomatic minister, is a fellow named Genet, who insists on being called Citizen Genet, which was the way revolutionaries addressed each other. The moment he arrives, he's very much welcome. After all, he is French, there's still some sympathies. And immediately he tries to basically buy a whole series of privateers, which are ships, private ships that you can arm to carry out your dirty deeds. Okay, it was common in many navies to do that. If you didn't have enough, big ships, then you asked several private ones. Of course, he's doing this with British captured ships, putting an American crew on it, and then of course sending them out to go and harass the British or any other group. But in so doing, of course, the Americans say, excuse me, your American territorial borders, Baltimore is United States, you can't do that, please. And Genet says, what, me? As you can see from that illustration. And what is interesting is that both Federalists and Democratic Republicans at the time, these are the two real factions in US history, are both saying, no, we are neutral, you don't understand, you can't do this. It reaches a point where even his strongest supporter, Thomas Jefferson, who to the very end of his life is pro-French, says, we can't keep you here. And he, in fact, sends a message to Paris. Paris is in the middle of its terror regime, okay, but they get the message, look, we don't want this guy anymore, can you recall him, okay? Diplomatic relations can legally allow you to legally send back a representative, but at the time you had to make sure that the other side recalled him. And the other side recalls him, but under suspicion of treason, even though he was trying to help the French Revolution. And this is the problem of this time frame of 1793-94. The common say is the revolution devours its own people. And this is what is happening. Anybody under possible suspicion gets the guillotine. Genet becomes very much afraid, begs George Washington not to send him back, because in fact there's a rumor that the very ship that is carrying his replacement has a mini guillotine. There's no proof of that, but that's something that he said. Okay, in other words, he thought, that's it, they're going to chop my head off right there at the moment we're at sea. And George Washington, interestingly, says, we are angry at him for what he did in the name of France, but we do not want to punish an individual who is begging for mercy and is promising essentially to be quiet. And so they allow Genet to stay. What happens to Genet? He moves up to New York. In fact, marries the daughter of Governor Clinton of New York at the time. And he lives out his days in the United States. But the Genet affair was interesting because there was a conflict between the US and France, but it led to further characterization of what it meant to have proper neutrality. How do you enforce it? How do you carry it out? And some of the experience from the Genet affair is what we will see then applied in the context of World War I until 1917, and of course the initial 2 years of World War II before the US enters the conflict. So it has a very interesting impact on the history of the United States and its international relations down the road. What else happens in that time frame? The UK and the US signed a treaty to resolve stuff that they had not quite resolved in the 1783 treaty. The leaders of the US questioned the friendship with the French and vice versa. The person who really orchestrates this signing is actually a young, or not so young by then, Alexander Hamilton. With, of course, Thomas Jefferson saying, are you crazy? Our real backing is the French. And it's a back and forth. Okay. But basically, what happens is that these Franco-American relations had already been in decline. The 1794 treaty makes things much worse. But the French don't have much time because they're still in the midst of their crazy revolution. And how crazy is it? The two leaders of something called the Committee for Public Safety, which oversaw the daily choppings that happened, themselves get chopped. One orders the other one arrested for treason and chops him, and then the last one basically fearing for his life, tries to defend himself. He's shot in the face, he survives, they prop him up, judge him, and then chop his head off as well. It's called the Thermidorian reaction from July 1794. But basically, the last 5 years of the French Revolution are back and forth of changing governments, shifting affairs, difficulty with the finances. This is what's going to clear the way for a gentleman you mentioned, the young Napoleon Bonaparte, who at the time was a revolutionary general, but soon will take power. If you thought it couldn't get much worse and that we should end for now, no, don't go away. We have the famous XYZ affair, and I swear, this is what it was called. This is not like some cheap Saturday morning skit, with little spies for kids. It was really named that. What happened was the following. John Adams, by then he's president, and he dispatches 3 ministers to France to negotiate a commercial agreement. Remember, John Adams had been very sympathetic to the French, so by 1797 he thinks, let's see how things have calmed down. It seems the situation has stabilized. And so what he wants is a commercial agreement to protect US shipping, not to have these crazy French privateers show up and take some of these supplies. And so they're approached by 3 French representatives, ostensibly, in fact, they're 3 French agents, who say, well, if you give us $250,000 at the time to pay Mr. Talleyrand, who you see here caricatured, then maybe, just maybe, we can start negotiations. Okay. This machination becomes very clear in April 1798. Why? Because these 3 representatives write back to John Adams and say, this is what we're facing. And why do they call it the XYZ affair? We know who these Frenchmen are. Okay, they're secret agents, basically. But because it's diplomatic material, they send agent X, agent Y, agent Z. So that's how it becomes the XYZ affair when it becomes public. And it gets made public. It's a huge outcry over these bribe solicitations. It's followed by preparations for war. And basically, we have ourselves a quasi-war that occurs between France and the United States. It's not a real war. No war was ever declared. Okay? But indeed, you had a whole series of privateers engaging the US Navy. This is, in fact, the true start of the United States Navy. This is when some of its young captains and some older ones actually start getting basically the experience that is going to, of course, be useful to them later on, 1812, and of course many other wars later on. This back and forth, let me see, I'm trying to remember, lasts about 2 years, and then it's settled by a convention in 1800 between the two. Basically saying, oh, it's nothing, we didn't mean it. Both sides basically tried to settle it. In other words, there's much more interest on both sides to just set it aside, have a stable situation between the two nations. Also because when you look at the numbers, the US Navy did capture about 85 French ships, not the actual ships, but not government ships, but privateers. Okay, so that had been bought off by the French government. But at the same time, the United States lost approximately 2,000 merchant vessels. So it is in the interest of both sides to just end this nonsense and move on. As for Talleyrand, I'm mentioning him because there's an interesting irony later on. But Talleyrand is either considered one of the most brilliant diplomats of his era, or the biggest hypocrite ever, because he served no fewer than 6 different royal regimes and revolutionary regimes in his time. But you'll see a little irony at the end. And so this is how we come, in fact, to consider, what happens next. It's essentially, memory transmits history, as I like to call it. I need to just define a couple of things for you all to understand. Of course, some of you remember Vietnam, maybe you remember World War II through your parents, etc., indirectly. But we always have a memory that extends beyond what we can remember ourselves. That's something that historians like to study because of course memory is fallible, it's human. And so we have a certain vision that serves our interests. That's why history is so much fun. We reinterpret it, but sometimes memory gets in the way, you know. As one of my dear college friends, I'm still in touch with him, once said, he was really into history, he was a biologist. He said, this was during the time when there were like economic stress between the US and Japan in the late 1980s. He says, what is it, Guillaume? Did we beat the Japanese once? Things you might say indeed as a joke in the bar over a cup of coffee. I understand that completely, but in terms of diplomatic relations, that's not something you would want to say, okay? But this is what memory does. It's like, you know, oh, well, we won then, so therefore we should win now. And in fact, this memory of the Revolutionary Wars was also something that tugged at the relations of these two countries. True, the French don't get much involved any further in United States matters in the 19th century. They have other things to do. They're busy dealing with an emperor, Napoleon I, and then another couple of kings, another revolution, another emperor, another revolution, etc., all the way to World War I. And of course, in the meantime, we have more pressing concerns called Germany. So we leave them aside here, but we pick up again later on. Why? Because this initial memory of a French alliance, regardless of its ups and downs, the XYZ affair, the problems with the French Revolution, still plenty of people recorded it as the French helped us. Even though it was likely a pecuniary engagement, after all, in international relations, you supposedly never have friends. You have just different degrees of enemy. That's the way several major statesmen have said it. Okay. So did France view us as, you know, a convenience? Probably, but there are enough people who volunteered to help to make clear that it went beyond simply a pecuniary or international relations interest. There was a genuine wish to see this experiment succeed. What is ironic is that when you look at the number of people who emigrated to the United States in the 19th century, there's barely any French. You've got Germans, Irish, Jews, everybody, Russians, you name it, Italians, of course, sorry, I didn't mean to forget the Italians, but you name it, they are there. French don't emigrate. Why? They've got themselves a good country, they fit in, they're busy, of course, with their revolutions, but they don't have extreme poverty the way the other countries are experiencing. That's the paradox of France. And so you have this relationship of, you know, loving the United States, but also thinking, well, what an interesting place, it's worth studying, it's like kind of a biological experiment, and you put it in a petri dish. Alexis de Tocqueville, in fact, interviewed some of the revolutionaries from the US still alive to write about democracy in America, a book that is still required reading in international relations. But beyond this, the French are not that interested in the US. When does it change? Well, as France finally figures out what it means to be a democracy. And I'm sorry to take it a little bit off topic, but it's relevant. In 1789, they tried. First Republic lasted basically a couple of years, and then we're going to leave it at that, and the emperor comes in. Second Republic lasted barely a year, and then another emperor came in. 1871, we finally have a Third Republic. Profoundly unstable, by the way, but it is a democracy. Okay? And this democracy is desperate to affirm the values of democracy. And one of the things that a lot of people view is, look at these guys, you know, okay, they had a civil war, they had this, they had that, but they are still a democracy somehow. Let's help them celebrate. It is in this context, this discourse, which was not, by the way, accepted universally, because you still had a bunch of royals in France who wanted to have royalty back, but that they decided in 1876 to commission this famous statue by Auguste Bartholdi. On the left, you can see the hand as it's being sort of, cast in a particular building it's in the 17th district near northern Paris. And of course, the head. In the middle, of course, you have the model of the statue, but to the left, it's the statue named Libertas. Libertas was the Greek goddess of fulfillment and therefore freedom. Now, Roman freedom is a relative term if you think of ancient Rome, but it was this notion that in fact you had to feel comfortable with yourself and with your surroundings. And so Libertas will inspire the drawing by Auguste Bartholdi. Of course, 1876, that was the announcement for the Centennial of the United States. It takes them another 8 years to complete the cursed thing. And then, of course, you have to figure out how to transport it, where to install it, and France pays for the statue, but doesn't pay for anything else. So where do you put it? How do you raise money to put the foundations, all of this? This is on a US committee, that's why it took so long, but 1886 it's in. And this was, in many ways, at least culturally, a symbol to acknowledge that, well, of course, the French had this view saying, we inspired the United States, excuse my language, but bullcrap. They borrowed from the United States for their model. And of course, by the time we reach World War I, what do we have? Well, we have the, at the time they were called, nicknamed the Doughboys, okay? The American GIs if you prefer. And many, in fact, yelled as they disembarked from the ship, Lafayette, nous voilà, Lafayette, here we are. Okay. And in fact, you already had many volunteers pre-1917 showing up. But in 1917, the first official American pilot killed in action is a fellow named Genet. And he is the great-grandchild of Citizen Genet, the guy who stirred trouble and then settled in the United States quietly. This is one of his great-grandchildren, who volunteered for the Lafayette Escadrille in the Lafayette Squadron in 1916, when they were accepting American volunteers, but unofficially, until they were trained by the French. And then in 1917, of course, when the US enters the war, the Lafayette Squadron then becomes part of the American Army Air Force, what becomes the American Army Air Force. And first person, actually, American pilot killed in action is killed in action in 1916. But it's not official. He's fighting for the French. He's the first one to die fighting for the United States. Okay. But there's an interesting irony that way. I want to leave you with one more irony and maybe a little so what question. The ironies of everything. Remember Talleyrand, the sneaky little guy with his XYZ affair? This is his, as they call it now back then, hotel, which is not a hotel, it's the building, okay? This building is sold shortly after Talleyrand's passing to various noblemen, and eventually in 1945 it is bought by the United States government. Why? Well, because it's big, it's comfy, it's literally 200 yards from the Élysée Palace, which is the French version of the White House. In other words, you have, an eye and an ear on what goes on in France. It's also actually beautifully situated next to the Place de la Concorde, the place where they used to chop heads off. This is Talleyrand's house, and it is now the United States Embassy to this very day. The ambassador's residence is a little bit apart, and of course, sadly, this is a beautiful picture. If you try to come closer, you've got 500 cops, 24 US Marines, anti-everything, because of course we live in the age of terrorism. So sadly, the circumstances have made it far less pleasant to look at, but this is the way it used to look like for many years. Now they've got little antennas to listen in on everything. Every country does that. Let's try and ask ourselves this question this evening. I've introduced you, invited you to see sort of this complicated start of a relationship. I always remind my students we can talk about history and try and remember it for the sake of history being a vessel of understanding the past, also not repeating mistakes of the future, which we often do, but still we're trying, okay? So what in this case? It's complicated precisely because it's a special relationship that goes back 250 years. If you look at recent books on France published in the United States, some of course are The Love Story, Weekend in Provence, or The Best French Cooking, thank you to whichever cook has reintroduced something or other. Absolutely.
When does de Gaulle come into it?
I'm sorry?
When does de Gaulle?
Oh, de Gaulle, he's a complicated one. De Gaulle, very briefly to answer your question, he is fighting in World War I. He's taken prisoner in 1916, spends the rest of the war in a German POW camp. In World War II, he is the only French leader to say no to the Germans. And basically, he and approximately 1,500 poor Slavs go to London, where a fellow who really has issues with the French, nonetheless decides he's the good guy. This guy's name is Churchill. And Churchill is the one who sells de Gaulle to the Americans, because the Americans don't take him very seriously. That said, de Gaulle has a very complicated relationship with the United States, and an unpleasant one, I must say, honestly. But yeah, he's also one of those guys who made that relationship complicated. Okay. Now, when you look at these books, back to these books, sometimes you see books that are entitled "Our Worst Friend," or "Our Best Enemy," or "Our Frenemy." It's about France and its tricks. They're no worse, by the way, than what the British have pulled on the United States, what the Germans have pulled on the United States. It's just a different culture that sometimes people have trouble understanding. True, when you look at these pictures, I'm showing you 3 instances where the United States were key. The one of the 2 generals standing, that's General Pershing and Marshal Foch. Okay. By the way, the only time a US force was ever under the control of a French general. Never happened since, okay, but that was under circumstances it was necessary. Of course, you recognize a picture probably from D-Day, okay, where basically this 1 million plus organized tourist sorts saved Europe from Nazism, with the help of the Soviet forces, of course, we have to acknowledge that. Further down to the right, these are French troops engaged in the war in Indochina, except that the United States paid for 80% of the French engagement. Not the soldiers, but the weapons, the planes, everything else. That was 80% paid by the US. Before, of course, the French withdrew, and unfortunately the US went in with the results we know. The last one's a little bit different. It's showing you a French nuclear bomber that was converted to reconnaissance. And the French kept that thing going, even though it was completely obsolete, because it was really good at taking pictures fast over regions that satellites couldn't cover. And throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, in fact, the United States relied on this to actually know what to do. The operations in Serbia and during the war in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. In Iraq, discreetly, even though the French did not go in with the Americans. But most importantly, in Afghanistan, most of the pictures that they got were in fact taken by this kind of reconnaissance aircraft. In other words, true, most of the time it's the US that has helped the French military. There's no question their budget alone is pretty stupendous. But it's overlooking the fact that the US cannot be the power that it is without allies. The French in this case, for this evening, but let us remember the other ones. I'll make one political statement, and I apologize if I offend some of you. NATO was created by the United States. NATO is useful. When we were attacked on 9/11, NATO invoked Article 5. That's why you had these Mirage jets flying over Afghanistan. Let's move aside from the naughty rhetoric that we see on tweets and texts, okay? These alliances matter. In international relations, there is a concept known as special relationship. That will be my final point for tonight, I promise. It's a concept that's about 40, 50 years old, and it basically defines, it says there are special relations between certain countries that cannot simply be defined on the basis of friendship, but on the basis of cultural affinity, political interests, economic interests, and also sometimes a common history. One of the strangest, so you've got obvious cases, okay? France and the UK. Strange one, France and Germany. But every time a new president or chancellor comes in, they call Washington, they call Berlin or Paris, say, okay, it's good, is it? 3 wars in 70 years, they sort of got the message, let's be friends. There's a special relation between the United States and France, the United States and the UK. A strange one that exists, Germany and Israel, precisely because of the crimes of the Holocaust. And it's something important to acknowledge. And so I submit to you that, in fact, this is a special relationship. No, it's not always going to go well. In fact, it went horribly during the Iraq War, when people were talking about freedom fries or sending the Statue of Liberty back. But at the same time, this is part of the ups and downs of an international relationship. And I hope that this evening I was able to introduce you to a little bit, at least its origins through these revolutionary wars. So I thank you, and I'll open to any questions you may have.